Welcome to our Text of the Month event for July. This month we have a special guest speaker who is Matthew Akester, who is one of our oldest in-house translators, in the sense that he's been with the project from the very, very beginning, pretty much. I think Matthew was the first translator that we recruited for the project. And it was very much largely due to his history with studying the life of Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo. So Matthew is an expert on the life of Khyentse Wangpo, and particularly the historical works associated with Khyentse Wangpo in the collection. So in the Khyentse Wangpo Kabun, there is a whole volume of historical texts that Matthew has very kindly been translating for the project. And we're continuing to work on these and publish them one by one. So Matthew has lived in the Himalayas for a very, very long time. He's a scholar and a translator. He's published the Khyentse Wangpo's Guide to Central Tibet, which is a pilgrimage guide, also The Life of Khyentse Wangpo, and some other publications as well. And we're very, very honored to have him as part of our team, and very delighted to have him here today to talk about Khyentse Wangpo, and particularly to talk about the historical works of Khyentse Wangpo in the collection. So as many of you know, Khyentse Wangpo has composed an enormous range of works, and his collection is incredibly erudite as it is vast. And his works range from poetry to pilgrimage guides, to histories, to songs, to rituals, liturgies, and all kinds of other treasures in there. So Matthew's contribution to the project is to help us focus on the historical works, which are in themselves a whole particular type of genre, which Matthew will talk a little bit about today for us. So thank you so much, Matthew, for agreeing to do this talk, and welcome. Welcome, everybody. And yes, please, at the end, there'll be time for questions. So please keep note of any questions that you have as we go, and then we'll have time for them at the end. Thanks so much, Matthew. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to Khyentse Vision Project for the opportunity. So yeah, this talk will be about the historical writings in the collection. There are basically 5 of them. As Doma said, they are all included, I think, in the 11th volume of the original edition of 18 volumes. 4 of them are distinct works in their own right, and one of them is a large collection of basically notes and sketches on biography and history. So one of those 4 is the Denrab, as we call it for short, the Kangjong Denrab, or the list of names of the lineage holders of the Vajrayana schools in the land of snows, which is, the longest and the most significant of all of them, really. And that is the text of the month, this month. And I'm going to get onto that later, but I'm going to start, if I may, by putting all of these works into sort of context, how and when they were written, and shed some light. I mean, the light that these works allow us to shed on Khyentse's life. So one of the things that I discovered when I started to work on the translation of all of these texts is that they were basically all written around the same time, during the same phase of his life, which is in the 1840s, when he was in his 20s. In 1840, he arrived at Ngor Monastery to pursue his highest, supposedly to take bhikshu ordination, and to pursue his higher studies. This was not unusual, because basically all monks at Dzongsan Monastery in Dege are supposed to do that. That's the tradition. They're all expected to travel when they are of age, to travel to Ngor, to take higher ordination, bhikshu ordination, and to receive some of the main empowerments of the tradition. And in some cases, they'll stay for a while and do higher studies. So that's a normal thing. But in Jamyang Khyentse's case, he wasn't a normal monk. He had already been recognized as the Tadse Shabdrung, the reincarnation of the Lama of Tadse, which is the oldest and most respected of the 4 colleges at Ngor Monastery. The Ngor Monastery is, I should maybe add, the second center of the Sakya school in central Tibet, and it's near Shikatse. And there are 4 Labrang in the monastery. Tadse Labrang is one of them, as I say, the oldest and most distinguished. And when he was a child, Khyentse had been recognized as the reincarnation of the Tadse Lama, so he was called the Tadse candidate or Shabdrung, and had a long-standing invitation to come up to Ngor and probably to stay there and become the next abbot of Tadse Labrang, you know, for the rest of his life. That was the idea. So that it was on that basis that he arrived at Ngor. In fact, he didn't do that. He declined taking higher ordination, and instead went off on his own sort of volition and took higher ordination at Mindraling in the Nyingma tradition instead, which shows something of his eclectic and slightly rebellious, probably, attitude at that time. And soon after that, he, as well as in addition to his studies at Ngor during this period, this is also the time that he embarked on wide-ranging travels, pilgrimage travels all around central Tibet, in a very modest style. Unlike the High Lamas of those times, he just traveled like a simple pilgrim, covered an enormous amount of ground. And so the pilgrimage guide that was referred to earlier, where he basically covers the entire terrain of central Tibet for the benefit of pilgrims who want to visit the holy places, it was also composed in this time. Oh, it wasn't composed in this time, but the travels took place in that time. It was probably composed later, but that was part of his experience at this time, let's say. But what I want to get to here is one of the main things that kept him busy at Ngor during his studies at Ngor. He was coming to study with his root gurus, who were the nephews of the former Tatsela, Nankachime. Tatse Kenshin Nankachime was the name of the former Tatse abbot and his former incarnation. So his nephews had been responsible actually for recognizing him, and they were also responsible for his education. So he was studying under the 2 Tatse nephews during his time at Ngor, and one of his fellow disciples of the Tatse Kenshin nephew, Ngawang Lekdrup, the Ngor Punlok Ngawang Lekdrup, the 2 of them were sort of put in charge, or were the main active figures in the establishment of a shedra at Ngor, a sort of college for higher studies, because they were brilliant scholars and because they had studied or showed prowess in the study of the Rigne, or the Vidyasthana. And this was the idea of the shedra in that time, was to re-establish and promote the study of the ordinary sciences, as they're called, Rigne, in Tibetan, as part of the monastic curriculum. And so the Ngor Shedra was set up for that purpose. The main subject of study was Sanskrit grammar and poetics among the Rigne. And that is how he spent the first sort of phase of his education as a young man. That was the emphasis. And his writings on these subjects basically come from that time. I want to add here that one of the things I discovered in the collection, the large collection that I mentioned, is a biography. It's probably the only complete biography that he wrote as an original work, and it has a complete colophon explaining how and when it was written, which is very interesting. And it's the biography of a relatively little-known figure who was called the Sakya Yongzi, Jampa Kungatashi, who had been a leading disciple of Jamgon Khyentse Lodro. Jamgon Khyentse Lodro was a very significant figure for Khyentse. He was the Sakya Dakchen through the mid-18th century, the head of the Sakya monastery and the head of the family lineage. And he was also an eclectic master. He had a lot of links with the Nyingma tradition. In particular, he had received the transmission of the Tsapa teaching within the which Khyentse Lodro had received from his guru, the Nesa Lama, the incarnation, the incarnate lineage of Sachen, and which he passed on to Tatse Khenchen Nankachime Khyentse's previous incarnation. So this was the special sort of lineage or branch of the Sakya teachings which came directly to Khyentse. That's Khyentse Lodro. So Khyentse Lodro, what this biography tells us, one of the things that this biography of Sakya Yongzin tells us, is that Khyentse Lodro was interested in setting up a Shedra at Sakya, precisely for this reason, to encourage the study of the Rigni, which were seen to be important. And one of his, it's mentioned in the context of this biography, is because he wanted a successor to be able to teach and pass on the transmissions and empowerments to his family successors. This is how it works in the Sakya tradition, father to son transmission of the core teachings. He wanted a tutor, that's what Yongzin means, to first of all become learned in all these things so that he could pass them on, but also to become a competent channel for the transmission of the main teachings, the Lamdre and so on, to the next generation of the Sakya Lamas. And that is one of the intentions that Khyentse Lodro is said to have had in setting up this college. Very interestingly, the person, when they looked around for a master of studies, Khyentse Lodro needed somebody to basically run and instruct at this Shedra. They chose a scholar from Dege, who was fairly well known, but not extremely famous, the Shechen Drungyik, Tenzin Gyatsen. He was a master of Sanskrit studies, having studied himself with Shuchen Sujam Rinchen, one of the great 18th century masters in Dege and a Sakya master. And he traveled to Dege in order to take up this work. So very, very interesting connection we see in this context between Dege and central Tibet and this. I'll explain, I suppose I should explain why this is important. Because, well, first of all, let me say that the Sakya Shedra, which is highlighted in this biography, was probably the inspiration or the direct model for the Shedra that was later set up at Ngor in Khyentse's time, during Khyentse's time at Ngor, in fact. And the Ngor Shedra itself became the model for the Dzongsa Shedra, which was set up the College of Higher Studies and of the studies of these ordinary disciplines at Dzongsa Monastery in Kham, which was set up later during Khyentse's life. But there were, there was a proliferation of these institutions being established in Kham, particularly in Dege, through the mid and late 19th century, all with this same emphasis on the studies of the ordinary sciences as a foundation for monastic education. And these places basically became, because the intellectual life really of Tibetan Buddhism had shifted to Kham during this period, and this is one of the expressions of this is the fact that these Shedras in the great monasteries in Kham that came up through the second half of the 19th century became really the main centers for study, learning, and the arts, for all of Tibet. Many of the great masters from that time and scholars, had all studied there, including, many of the lamas that we're familiar with, the ones who came into exile in the middle of the 20th century. Many of them, had their formation and their training in these institutions. So here from the inception of this institute in Sakya in the second part of the 18th century, we see this development, and this was a core part of Khyentse's background and who he was and where he came from. And it's sort of important to understand because the study of the Vidyasthana is a real theme in the Rime tradition. The idea that the study of these non-religious disciplines, these various fields of knowledge, is an essential prerequisite for following the path, right? And there's a famous quote from Sakya Pandita in this respect, where he emphasizes this. So it's sort of a correction to maybe more sort of fundamentalist ideas especially in the practice traditions that that's irrelevant to the religious path. You can just go straight into the practice and become awakened. And Sakya Pandita and others in the tradition say no. You have to study all the fields of knowledge before you can approach awakening. So this is a sort of a theme. And it's a theme which is picked up by the Rime masters of the 19th century, in fact, starting in the 18th century. Really, I think it's fair to say, as a reaction to developments in Tibetan Buddhism in central Tibet and to the Gelugpa fundamentalism, which had begun to form with the corporatization of the Gelugpa school. It's becoming the state religion after the establishment of the Ganden Pochang state in Lhasa and so on. So that you get a kind of intellectual conformity and rigidity, which tends to only emphasize the practice manuals of the Gelugpa tradition within whichever monastery it is, and other things falling by the wayside. So in this Rime emphasis on restoring the study of the Rigne, we see a reaction to that and an appeal to earlier tradition, the re-establishment of earlier traditions. So many of these, I mean, Sanskritists were rare in Tibet by this time, and probably arguably always had been. But some of these other disciplines had been neglected as a part of education and not seen as important enough, and all of that. So this is, I'm just saying, a big issue. And one of the practical really concerns of the Rime tradition, and the roots of this tradition in its later form, in the form that we're familiar with, that took root and developed in Kham during the 19th century. Really, the most seminal figure in that is Situ Penchen Chökyi Jungne, the great Situ, who was the collaborator of King Tepetsering, the founding of the Degye Pakang, the editor of the Degye edition of the Kangyo. He was Tibet's greatest ever Sanskritist by renown. He was also one of Tibet's greatest doctors, one of its greatest artists, and also an accomplished master, of many religious Vajrayana practice traditions. So an extraordinary figure. And although he's not mentioned really very much in the literature on Khyentse, he's not mentioned in the antecedents or particularly as an influence. He obviously was one of, one of the most important influences, particularly in this regard in terms of the Rigne, because Khyentse, also became a master of these things. And had established this extraordinary precedent. So there was a basis. I mean, the roots of this movement, if we call it that, or intellectual tendency, were in Degye the greatest masters. There's also, of course, the Kato Rizin, Sawang Nobu. I also mentioned Shuchen, Sochen Rinchen, the great masters of the 18th century, were participants in this and were the important antecedents of the ones that came up later in Khyentse's generation. But there were also like-minded figures and collaborators in central Tibet. Janggon Kunga Lodro of Sakya was one of them, who we just mentioned. Another one was the Shalu Lama Loze Tenkyong, who was one of Khyentse's most important teachers, and who shared Situ Rinpoche's concern with reviving the Jonang tradition, which had been banned by the Lhasa government. And so on. So all of this background is invoked by what we're talking about here. I'm just covering it very briefly. So Khyentse was a precocious master of the Rigne, the fields of learning, grammar and medicine in particular, like Situ Rinpoche. In this period, he was known, people referred to him as, we can tell from the literature, he was referred to as the Degye Pandita, because he was still, in his mid-20s. But he was regarded, already at that time as an extraordinary scholar, and master of these disciplines, these non-religious disciplines. But he didn't choose to pursue them in later life. So he returned to Degye in 1851, after his decade or so at Ngor, and really embarked on a new phase of his career, which was the study and practice and exegesis of all the teachings, the religious teachings which he had, acquired up to that point, including and especially those which he had acquired by visiting all these places in central Tibet and visiting masters of the old traditions and so on. He went back to Dege and put them into practice. And from that time, we don't see him showing much interest, continued interest in the study of the Rigni. So that's an introduction to say that basically this is where the historical studies fit in to his life. It was in this period while he was concerned with the study of the Rigni and was also traveling a lot in central Tibet. That is the time when he seems to have also taken on the study of history and composed also a couple of historical works. Later on, he moved on, didn't bother himself with such mundane studies. What we can see from reading these 5 works is, first of all, extraordinarily wide reading and learning, considering, that he was still a relatively young person. The application of fairly rigorous scholarly approach. He was interested in accuracy and scholarly correctness. He saw that as important. And of course, we can see a strong concern to really study and do justice to all the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, rather than just the one he belonged to, which is, of course, one of what we think of as defining really the Rime approach. But it's very clear already in these early works that he had been doing that from an early stage and had studied widely in each tradition, with respect to each. However, according to his biographers, his knowledge of history was, in addition, this is what they mention about his knowledge of history, was greatly enhanced by the authority of his experience, because Khyentse Wangpo had a galactic heritage of past lives. The list of his previous incarnations in his biographies comes to something like 70 or more names. Many of them household names in Tibetan Buddhism, extremely famous, influential masters. He had been all of these people, or had known them, throughout his recorded previous lives, and that is what his biographers pick up on as being his important contribution to history. So in the biography by Do Drupchen, it's written there, when this Mahapurusa explained history, he did so with a wealth of consistent detail, not to be found in written archives from the distant or the recent past, which boggled the minds of his listeners and evidently came from his recollection of previous lives. For example, and Jamyang Khyentse in the long biography wrote, at that time, and here he's referring to 5th or 6th century India, he had been a very close friend of Pandita Purnavardhana, of whom Litang Geshe Champa Punso was the reincarnation. Litang Geshe was one of Khyentse's he was an older contemporary, but he was one of his main Gelugpa teachers. Right? And he said that at their meeting earlier that year, there had been a close meeting of minds, and he recalled some of their discourses from past life impressions. It seems that he was continually aware of such amazing recollections from previous lives, but apart from relating some of the more extraordinary ones, when in an exuberant frame of mind, he never spoke of them. Or if he did tell others, I have not heard of it. And there does not even seem to be any authoritative list of his occasional or minor reminiscences. So that is our loss, really. We don't have any record of all these amazing reminiscences and recollections, except that the long biography by Khyentse does record quite a few of them. So it at least gives us a flavor of what that was like. So apart from this extraordinary connection, I'm still making general remarks here. Khyentse and Kongtrul were serious. I mean, they took the study of history seriously. And we can see that that's part of the Rime concern. They're a part of, their work and their lifelong projects, which were to do with preservation, particularly of the minor and neglected traditions, restoring them to the historical record, as well as restoring, their transmissions and their teachings and so on. And historical accuracy at least was seen by them as an important part of that process. They wanted to get the chronology right. They saw history as a useful, um, discipline which needed to be followed in the presentation of essentially this preserved, tradition, trying to keep alive, or at least to preserve, things which have been long lost, which are of great value. So history is a part of that enterprise. I think we could also say that he was certainly influenced by some of the historical works of his predecessors, his sort of immediate predecessors, because during the 18th century generally, and particularly in Eastern Tibet, we see sort of a new practices coming up in the writing of history. We see the composition of really compendious and monumental works of history, reviews of large areas of information. Two of his most influential gurus, Khyentse's influential gurus, wrote such works. Dragompa, Khyentse Rabgye, the Lama of Labrang, and along with Litan Geshe, one of his main Gelugpa teachers, wrote the Dome Chenjong in this period. Shalu Loze Tenkyong, who I mentioned, another of his important, or actually his root teachers, wrote an enormous history of the Shaolu monastery that he belonged to. Other works that we could consider in this category: Jigme Lingpa's History of the Nyingma Gyubum, Guru Tashi's history of the Nyingma tradition, and particularly the Terma tradition, the Guru Tashi Chenjong. Tuken Losan Chökyi Nyima wrote his famous survey comprehensive history of the Drupta, the different philosophical schools, covering them one by one, and ultimately establishing the primacy of the Gelugpa school, but that's another thing. And Sita Penshen also, of course, wrote a voluminous history of the Karma Kagyu schools. So I think some of these works are sort of framed as comprehensive, systematic studies which have elements of an approach that we might characterize as secular or modern. I'm pointing to a sort of development in Tibetan historical writing, which is sort of moving closer to what is understood as historical writing in a more global context, and which are actually more accessible to modern readers than the more traditional works. But it's not very easy to make a direct argument about this. There are many nuances. It's just a suggestion, really, an impression, but I'm just pointing to it as a source of influence. I mean, it's not that we don't have examples of such literature earlier on. One of the greatest monumental works of religious history in Tibet, the Depten Ngompo, written by Golot Sawa in the late 15th century, is precisely a Rime Chönjong, and is structured in that way, presenting information sort of on an equal basis, presenting information about a variety of different traditions and schools, as if they were all valid. So absolutely in the Rime spirit, and well before the 18th century. So, it's hard to make an absolute case about this, but I just want to suggest that the Khyentse and Kongtrul in their labors, and particularly Kongtrul in his composition of the 5 treasuries, reviewing, the entire Tibetan Buddhist legacy, was influenced probably by this style of writing. I mean, we know that Khyentse had avidly studied all of the works that I just mentioned and quotes from them. So we know that. One little example I could mention is in his writings on there are sort of scattered writings on the history of the Terma tradition in the big collection, in which he makes an attempt to give a chronology of when the successive tertons appeared, which is a sort of a modern concern. Is not something we see so much in the tradition before that. And in doing so, he makes reference to a master of the New Bern tradition, Kundra Dragpa, who's early first half of the 18th century master scholar and master of the Bern tradition, what's called the New Bern school, who had done this in relation to the Bern Tema tradition, attempted to give a chronological dating, which is a work we see Khyentse's notes on that work in the collection, and we also see his notes using the writings of Kundra Dragpa, his notes comparing or just noting the identities and differences between those tertons who were claimed by both the Bonpo and the Buddhist tradition. So considering, directly comparing, this is kind of, it's kind of new. We don't see that in the literature before this period, really. So basically, in Kongtru's treasuries, which are sort of written a bit later and directly inspired by Jamyang Khyentse, particularly the Sheja Kunkyat and of course the Rinchen Tenzu, you can see the impression that the influence of Khyentse, the direct influence. In some cases, we can see passages and pieces of information repeated there that we recognize from Khyentse's earlier historical works. So we can see, where this is going because it was actually Kongtru who turned these into large finished pieces of work, but it was Khyentse who was really giving the inspiration and guidance and probably a lot of the direct knowledge and information involved. So it's those works, the five treasuries of Kongtru, in which we really see the fruition of what I'm talking about, these historical studies and labors. Okay, I think that will do. So let me now go on to just describing the writings themselves, the compositions. The first one is called a Beltam. It's the earliest one. That's why I say it's the first one. A Beltam is kind of a monologue or a learned discourse, which is delivered usually in front of a large assembly. And we can tell from references in the biographical literature that Khyentse actually delivered this to the Great Assembly in Ngo in 1843, when he was 23 or 24 years old. Some of you may have seen this in certain monastic assemblies on special occasions or feasts or, something like that. A speaker will stand up and just address the assembly for a long period, up to an hour or two, or probably even more. This particular Beltam probably would take at least an hour to deliver at quite high speed. And it is absolutely a historical work, but it covers sort of the entire field of the history as conceived in the Tibetan tradition, in the sense it starts with the formation of the structure of the universe and its contents, the outer form and the inner contents of the universe, according to various cosmological schemes, and then it moves on to the history of Buddhism in India, and then the history of Buddhism in Tibet, and then the kings of India, and then the kings of Tibet, and ends the kings of Tibet with Gyarab, or a dynastic history of the kingdom of Dege. So this is a very traditional format and style, and it's very eloquent, full of detail, and poetically pleasing, and all of that. And it runs to 29 folios. It's quite long. And I actually earlier published a translation of this together with the guide because of its relevance. So this can be seen as his first historical work. And we see the section on the history of Buddhism in Tibet is the direct model for what is then elaborated at much greater length in the Denrab. Then there's a Chönjul. history of Buddhism, which doesn't say so. It doesn't have a date or a colophon, but it's obviously written around the same time and in the same style. This one deals with the history of Buddhism in India and then the history of Buddhism in Tibet, just up to Tenpa. So just the really concentrating on Tenpa, the 11th, 12th century period of the core development of the later Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Doesn't go beyond that, and then concludes with history of Buddhism in other countries, which is also a kind of convention that we find, I mean, in China, in Khotan, and Mongolia, and so on. It's quite short. It's 25 folios, which is quite short for considering the amount of material that it covers. And it's quite derivative in the sense the history of Buddhism in India, which makes up the first third or more of the work, is entirely taken from Taranatha's Jakar Chenjo, which is probably the only work that was known to later Tibetan scholars about the history of India. It's the only one of its kind. And here we see that Khyentse just works from that, doesn't have anything to add to that, and is just basically quoting and summarizing it. The section on the history of Tenpa in Tibet is more varied and is actually quite diligently researched, but we can tell that it's directly lifted, borrowed, from the standard sources on the subject, with Depten Wangpo, as I just mentioned, Buten Chenjong, and the Kepegate history of the Kagyu tradition by Paul Suklak Chengwa. And the section on history of Buddhism in China is taken from Gyanak Chenjong by Gung Gompo Kyao, who was an 18th century scholar. So it doesn't have a colophon. It's very, very poor quality of orthography, and spelling is full of spelling mistakes and even grammatical mistakes. It doesn't look like it was ever edited, but it is presented as a complete work, although it's it's not dated or doesn't have a colophon. Then there is a history of Sanskrit, the study of Sanskrit grammar in Tibet, which definitely comes from this period, although again, it's not dated or attributed. It's very short. It's only 5 folios long. But it shows, how much he had read and studied the literature, at least the literature in Tibetan, about the transmission of the Sanskrit grammatical canons to Tibet, in which he bases himself. You can see that this work is based on an introduction that Situ Penshin wrote to his enormous commentary on the Chandrapa Sanskrit grammatical system, in which he largely harps on all the mistakes that were made by Tibetans in the past. This is what Situ's commentary on Tibetan scholarship in Sanskrit is very scathing, because he just lists all the mistakes that they made and what they didn't understand and what they didn't know, and Khyentse sort of picks this up and repeats it. But it also includes a lot of the sort of anecdotes that you find in the literature generally about the origins of these different, there's a sort of stories and legends about the origins of these different grammatical works. So that's interesting. He attributes this, he says his source, his inspiration for writing this was a work which I can't identify, by Belotsawa Tsewang Kongkyap, who was the close disciple of Situ Penshin and sort of his secretary and scribe and a Sanskrit scholar. Supposedly, although that has been thrown into doubt by modern scholarship, especially Jean Smith, who didn't have a kind word to say about Belotsa. But Khyentse obviously thought that he was seems to have thought that he was a great master, and took his work as inspiration for this history. And then we have this huge collection. It's 250 folios, rambling, unsorted collection of notes, sketches, and sort of random writings on history and biography, which some of them were used. We can tell some of these notes that they're notes on works written by other authors. They're not without much original content, but we know that some of them were again used as sources for the Denrab, so we can date them to the same period or earlier than the Denrab was written. as far as I've been able to tell, there are just a couple of original compositions in this collection. One of them I mentioned, the notes on the Terma tradition. There's 2 or 3 texts which deal with the history of the Terma tradition, which are his own compositions. And as I mentioned, this biography of the Sakya Yongzin, which is a complete work, which he was requested to write when he visited Sakya in 1851. I guess disciples or colleagues of the Sakya Yongzin came to him and asked him to write this, probably because of his ancestry as you know, the reincarnation of Tatse Khyentse, who was a fellow disciple of the Sakya Yongzin of Kongala. So we have a long colophon explaining that. And there's also a praise. This is based on a praise. The biography is a commentary on verses of praise that he wrote to Sakya Yongzin, which are included in the first volume, I think, which has all the praises to various lamas. And then there's also a sort of personal history of his revelation of the Sampalundra Terma, which we are already familiar with because it was largely repeated in the biography by Kongtru, but fascinating work in which he, you know, in the first person describes, you know, the process through which he came to make a treasure revelation in concert with Chogyur Lingpa. So it's very key to his, you know, experience and contribution, and written very directly and approachably in the first person, without, you know, mystifying mystical poetry or anything, just telling his experiences. It's fascinating, but it's incomplete and it's quite short, and we already have it, as I say, in the biography. So that's that. So that leads me finally to the Denrab itself, the text of the month, which I will just try to briefly describe. Denrab is one of the genres of religious history in the Tibetan tradition, and it means usually an account or just a list of the names of the successive abbots or throne holders of a particular institution. So a great monastery, or in some cases a great tradition, will have its own Denrab. What Khyentse does in this work is takes this genre and applies it to the entire tradition of Vajrayana in Tibet, which is, as I've been trying to hint so far, is taking things somewhere else, is adapting traditional genres to a sort of slightly new conception of how history can be written, and it produces, you know, quite a rich collection of information. It's just over 100 folios long, and it's sort of in perfect condition, in the sense that it looks like it's been prepared, you know, for a wider audience and polished and so on, so it's the only work of that kind out of the historical works, and so, you know, by far the most important, significant. What it does is it goes through the traditions one by one, and the traditions are Nyingma, Kadampa, Sakya, Kagyupa, Gelugpa, the 5 main traditions, as he frames it. And then at the end, we have a collection, a smaller, shorter account of what he calls the minor traditions, which Jonangpa, Shalu, Bodongpa, Shangpa Kagyu, Shije, and Che. That's how it's framed, categorized in this work. And in each section, the coverage of each of these schools, he sort of applies the same formula. So he locates the seats of the tradition that's being discussed historically and geographically, which is quite unusual. And obviously based on, you know, direct knowledge, even experiential knowledge. And then lists their successive lineage holders, which is what a Denrab is supposed to do, including short biographies of the most important ones. So it does this for every monastery, every large monastery, and every school that's mentioned, right? So we've never seen anything like this before. And in some cases, he gives formally sort of the long numbered list in three cases, I think. In the Nyingma school, he does this for the Katok monastery. In the Sakya school, he does this for the Ngor monastery, the Ngor Denrab, Ngor monastery we've spoken about. That was very important to him, and had all these connections with Dege. And in the Gelugpa school, he gives us the Ganden Denrab in full, with sort of as a numbered list kind of thing. But the other Denrab are sort of more ad hoc, put together just from the sources that there are or that he knew. Then he also describes the distinctive features and approaches of that tradition. He lists the corpus of its teachings. He discusses the literature on the history of that tradition and the lives of the masters. Specifically, he picks up criticisms of those schools and their refutations. That's most significant in the Nyingma school, which has a large body of literature about refuting criticisms by other later schools. So he takes that up. And finally, at the end of each section, he gives the origin of the name. How did the name of the school originate? So it's kind of a template which he applies to each of the schools in turn. And this is, the first Denrab of its kind. We've never seen this done before. Denrab, as I say, traditionally applies only to one institution. So this is rather similar to the Naik, the pilgrimage guide, which covers all regions and all schools in a kind of geographical itinerary. Traditionally, the genre of Naik would only have been about one place, one monastery, one temple, even just one stupa or object. But a sort of trans-regional travel guide in the modern sense, the Khyentse's Naik is the first example of that. So it's a sympathetic composition. It's not, in the Tibetan tradition, often we find people just sort of taking passages from here and there and repeating them verbatim and then stitching them together. And that's not regarded as plagiarism, it's just regarded as historical work. But in the Den, and the Khyentse's Chunjung is a bit like that. But in the Denrab, we see he's really, he's doing a synthetic work based heavily on his sources. And his sources are, for the Nyingma section, obviously Guru Tashi. It follows very closely Guru Tashi's work on the Nyingma tradition. In the Kogyupa section, he's obviously following quite closely Situ Penshen's history of the Karma Kogyu. And in the Gelugpa section, he's sticking quite closely to Tuken. Tuken Drupta has a history of the Gelugpa school, which has obviously impressed him, and he relies quite closely on that. So that's quite evident from reading those sections. But it's not just like he's doing copy-paste. His accounts, despite quoting and relying heavily on earlier sources, really bear the authority and the lucidity of his extraordinary learning and his detailed knowledge of persons and places. We often don't get the sense in earlier Tibetan literature generally, that when an author in a context like this lists, the schools, that he actually knows where those places are and might have been there. Khyentse really gives us that sense here in the Denrab. But it's particularly in the Sakya section that we see this. The Sakya section is not based on any single source. It's based on a multitude of sources which show, a really extraordinary grasp of the literature of the tradition. And it's the longest section of all of the schools. It's the Sakya tradition, which is his own tradition, is given more attention. And it also includes, extra information. Particularly, it gives the history of this collaboration. I didn't talk enough about this, but it was a convention for a long time after the emergence of the kingdom of Dege as a great power in Eastern Tibet. The connection with Ngor monastery was really strengthened, and the Ngor abbots became, really the main gurus of the Dege kings, and were expected. Each Ngor Khenchen, after the expiry of his term, was expected to visit Dege. So there's a long history of this exchange, of all the great Ngor lamas visiting Dege and all the great works that they did there and the teachings that they gave and so on, and which is very much the background that Khyentse came from, because Tazi Khyentse was one of these. Tazi Khyentse died in Dege, having spent the last 10 years of his life there, for example, and he was the latest in a series of great Ngorpa lamas who did that. So here in the Sakya section, we get a sort of history, very authoritative, because it comes from someone, directly connected to that, of this exchange and who the figures involved were. And he also gives us biographies of the Tatse Khenche and of his nephews, who were his teachers in previous incarnation, respectively. So it goes into that kind of personally related detail. It's not an absolutely flat, objective account. It emphasizes certain things which were, well known to the author. We can tell from internal evidence that it must have been written by before 1853, because at one point he says that Panchen Tempe Nyima is the current Panchen Lama, who died in 1853. So that's just 2 years after Khyentse returned to Dege. And we know that it was the section on in the Beltam about the history of Buddhism in Tibet was the basis for the Denrab, which was delivered in 1843. So that's the decade in which we can pretty much assess, that it was written. There are interlinear notes in the text, and when we get to the Ganden Denrab, in the Gelugpa section, we can see that the list has been updated from the 1840s to roughly to about the 1880s. And there's no sign, as is often the case with interlinear notes, we don't know who wrote them. But somebody in the 1880s updated the list of Ganden abbots in the text. So it gives this list of minor schools at the end, 6 of them. And we can also see from this that this is a sort of premature take on what would later become the sort of hallmark scheme of the Rimé school in dealing with the Tibetan tradition of the Shingtai Chempogye, the 8 great chariots, rather than the 4 schools which were sort of politically dominant and are famous to everyone. The Rimé school spoke about 8 great chariots, which are the 8 authentic, distinct transmissions of Vajrayana wisdom into Tibet. And this is enunciated very clearly, beautifully in Khyentse's, in the biography by Kongtrul, the inner biography, outer, inner, and secret, in the inner section. Kongtrul presents this very directly, which is, should be consulted by anyone interested in this. But it's also used as the organizational basis for some of Kongtrul's treasuries, particularly the Damngakse is organized along this schema of the 8 great chariots. So we can see in the Denrab that Khyentse hasn't got there yet, right? Because he gives a different list, and hasn't, and also sort of tacks them on at the end as being minor or incidental. Whereas in the later works, we see them each represented, as a tradition in their own right, sort of equally. So that's another sign that it represents a sort of earlier, premature stage in his career. So I think basically I would just like to argue, or at least suggest, that the Denrab is a bit like the Neik, the Utsang Neik, the Guide to Pilgrimage Places in Central Tibet, in the sense that it's really reinventing a traditional genre with a new approach, which is, I don't want to emphasize that it's a new approach, but the approach is, trans-regional and trans-sectarian, which is not common. It's not unheard of, but it wasn't common in the tradition. Work sort of standardized structure applied to a vast subject is not something that Tibetan authors traditionally, attempted or thought of. And the organizing principles, like I say, the standard format that's imposed, used in the Denrab, applied to every school, sort of comparatively, is arguably, a secular and a modern approach. And certainly both of these works, the Denrab and the Neik, are very, approachable and are very clear and make a lot of sense to modern readers, more so than, the more traditionally conceived works. So that's sort of what they represent as innovations in Tibetan literature, I would suggest. Okay, I'm going to stop there and give opportunity for questions if there are any.
Thanks so much, Matthew. So many interesting things that you've been talking about. There are quite a few questions I actually have one to start with, just about the guidebook that you mentioned. You mentioned that it's also a derivative work, but new in the same sense that the Denrab was presented in a Rimé kind of organization way. Can you say a little bit more about how the guidebook was different from previous guidebooks? How it differed from previous books in that kind of genre before?
Yeah, well, as I said, Nei guidebooks, Nei there are a few different Kachaks, a few different genres traditionally, almost always apply to a particular institution. You have a Naik to a monastery or a sacred site. Khyentse takes us on an entire tour. The book is structured as a loop. It goes all the way through central Tibet, starting and finishing in Repe. And writes it as more or less in the terms of a modern guidebook, giving an itinerary for the traveler, even telling, which place you go to, from which place you go to which place, and so on. That's not, I mean, that's unheard of in traditional writing. It's very approachable. I mean, this wasn't really a composition in the sense that it's completely unadorned and it's almost written in ordinary language. And this is because we think that it was only written incidentally because possibly Kongtrul himself or some other master came to Khyentse at a later time, long after his return to Digi, and said, "We're going on pilgrimage to central Tibet. You know so much about this. Could you give us some guidance?" And he probably dictated it orally, right? Because there's no literary embellishment or anything like that. It's more or less just like an oral transmission or something like that. So it's hardly a work of literature, but just the approach, the conception is something that is quite distinct from earlier, traditional works in that genre. And thereafter, I mean, it's possible that there are earlier works that we don't know about. We can't have so much confidence, but this is the earliest one that we know about. And it's subsequently emulated and copied by other authors, mostly Eastern Tibetans writing about central Tibet. That's the context of the thing. They took Khyentse's work as a sort of a model.
Thank you. I think there's a number of other questions. Zach, did you have some questions? And then Pema Maya also had questions. Heidi also had a question. Do you guys want to jump in and unmute yourselves?
I'm happy to. I wonder if we should take questions from the general audience before, because there's one or two at least coming in from non-team members before we handle our own.
Sure.
There's at least one in the chats already, and maybe
Jamyang,
there's more.
would you like to ask your question?
Hello, yes, I can. So I wanted to know what was the audience for which those historical texts were written? What was the inspiration for Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo to write them? Was there, like a specific audience for which these texts were intended, and were they popular?
It's hard to say. I don't think as I say, most of them were not written, to be published. The Denrab is sort of singular in that respect. Most of them are sort of incomplete sketches which he wrote for his own benefit. They're part of his own studies. His notes on the majority are just his notes on other works, on other histories. So we don't think that they were really, designed to be read widely. The Denrab is different. Who were the audience? Tibetan religious scholars and devotees. The only work that we know among the ones that I've been discussing that we know was popular is the Naik, because it's such a practical work. It was of use to a lot of people and it was portable. So once it was carved on woodblocks at the Degye Paka, it was carried by a lot of Degye people and Eastern Tibetans visiting central Tibet, just because it was so authoritative, it was portable, it was such a useful thing to have. I don't think we can say that about any of his other historical writings. They would have been written by by cognoscenti, by people who are also into the study of the Tibetan tradition, rather than trying to reach out to a popular audience or anything like that. That wasn't really the world that they lived in at that time. So written for scholars, I think, but written with such a clarity and an ability to summarize effectively that they might have appealed more widely, you know, than other historical works of that time.
I actually have a couple of questions that are related, so maybe I'll insert at least one of them now. I mean, it seems like when you're talking about this period of his life, it's coming out of a time when he was studying extensively, and that inspired him to write historical texts. But I mean, would he have been studying history in some kind of formal sense, or how can you characterize his encounter with historical literature? Like, how would it have come about in the first place, or would it have been something sort of more personally driven? What can you say about that?
Yeah, personally driven, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
Not that he would have studied it formally. People didn't study it formally.
Right.
The study of history per se is you know, more common among secular figures in the Tibetan tradition. It was something that was undertaken by, you know, often, you know, members of the aristocracy, nobles, people who weren't monks, but who were educated and took an interest in the past, and so on. There's hyper-religious figures tend to think that history is irrelevant and you know, not worth bothering with. And one of the things that I've been saying is that Khyentse wasn't one of them. He obviously genuinely did think it was important, in the sense that he thought that all the Rigne were important. History is obviously not classified as one of the Rigne, but it is, you know, recognized in the tradition as, you know, an important discipline field of knowledge.
Is there any
Khyentse,
place where he like acknowledges some figure in his life as inspiring him to become more interested in history? Or
No.
does he ever express any self-reflection in his writings about the fact that he's doing something unusual by taking
No,
up
no, no,
history?
not at all. Not at all. No. What was I going to say? I mean, we can tell from the fact that the works I've been describing were composed when he was in his early 20s. You know, he had been avidly reading the literature, you know, from quite a young age. But he's not your ordinary student, right? I mean, he was extraordinarily precocious master who had gained wide learning in so many fields already at a very young age. He was also, let's remember, he was also a master of medicine. He's you know, listed in the canons of some of the great medical masters, although he never did much with it, or, you know, pursued it that much in later life in the same way as, you know, grammar, Sanskrit, and history. So he's not your typical history student.
My other main question that's just bearing on this, the fact that so many of the historical writings are not, you know, formal writings per se, but take the form of these notes. You know, one thing we're trying to get a grasp on so much of at TVP is to make sense of what is going on with his notes. I mean, you're basically hinting that it was for his own studies or for his own edification. So I mean, I'm wondering how you're picturing this. Like, he's picking up historical books and finding parts that are interesting to him, and then copying them down so he can remember them, essentially, or in certain cases, just taking his own, you know, like putting them in his own words a little bit for his own purpose, so that he can like look back at them later and.
Well, I think that's how you
things.
study. You don't just sit there reading the book, right? I mean, that's how you sort of engage with the material, maybe, and keep it. It's a normal practice, I think, for people studying literature. No, he's basically summarizing them. He's taking notes for his own benefit, and summarizing very long works into shorter ones, and biographies as well. In the long collection, we find his summary of, you know, existing biographies of many of the masters, you know, that were significant to him. Because that's what you do. And we don't know very much about how the collected writings were put together. But these were, you know, these were notes which had been probably stuffed in some drawer or left somewhere. And, you know, when they came to put his collected writings together, they just picked them all up and put them in one volume. Not very elegantly, and without any editorial, you know, insight or improvement. So that long collection in particular is quite a headache to untangle. because they were just also, you know, so you have to figure out where one ends and the next begins. They didn't even edit it to that extent, right? So I don't think they were intended for any other purpose than, you know, a certain time, which I think was in his 20s when he was studying all these things. And in a few cases, he did make, you know, sort of summary histories. The Sanskrit history of Sanskrit is one example. Another example, which I didn't mention, is the geographical literature, where he talks about Sakya Pandita's critique of ideas about the Neda of ancient India and whether these can be identified with Mount Kailash and all of that stuff, and all the Pittas in the Tantric tradition, the Chakrasambhara, 24 places and all of that. He actually wrote sort of what looked like discrete works which have titles, but they're not, you know, properly finished. They're not edited. They seem to have been written largely for his own benefit, but certainly in some cases. The Chönjung is also a little bit like that. They're sort of half-made works on a particular subject because he's just putting together all his knowledge and reading and some of his insights, but very little original content or comment, and nothing personal.
Heidi, would you like to jump in with your question?
Sure. First, I just wanted to comment on what you said about Tibetan masters in general not being interested in history, which strikes me as sort of shocking, because to me, in all my encounters with Dharma teachers, the very first thing they do is present history in the form of the lineage. It's like the very before they begin a teaching, to present the full lineage. So to me, that's a really very much grounded in history and thousands of years worth of history. So it's an interesting take that you say that it's a secular study. But my question, what was my question? I can't remember. First of all, did he travel mostly on foot or by horse?
Well, I think I said this about, I said this is an idea in you know, among religious people, so particularly among religious masters. There is a sense that you find generally in the literature. There's a sense among Tibetan clerics, you know, that we should really just focus on what matters, which is, you know, history is sort of, it's worldly. You know, it's not that important in terms of actually writing and making contributions in history. Of course, you know, the lineage of one's own school, you know, something that everybody takes seriously and might recite at the beginning of a teaching, but that's not the same thing as, you know, studying history and producing writings about it, right? And in the religious way of thinking, that's the only important thing about history, right? Other things are just, you know, worldly, insubstantial, not really worth bothering with, right? That's what I meant. We don't know a whole lot. There are a couple of comments, mostly by Kongtrul is the main person who makes comments about Khyentse's life. So we have comments like he traveled so hard that he wore out a pair of shoes and had to go barefoot. We know that some of his journeys he undertook with a single companion who was kind of like a manservant, a guy from Dege called Sultan, who was, you know, and we think that they had a horse to carry some of their gear most of the time, but that's it. So, and Khyentse probably would have been walking rather than riding the horse, we think.
So even as Grand Master, he was allowed to travel.
Well,
So
I don't think that he was. It's not that he was allowed to. He got up and left and did it. He didn't ask for permission, I think, and that's what I'm saying. From the fact that he didn't take ordination as expected at Ngor and decided, he went on his own, you know, initiative to Mintraling and asked to be ordained there as a bhikshu, right? So that shows certain attitude, and of course, he didn't stay in Ngor Monastery. He went back to Dege, you know, after a stay of 10 years and never returned. Although for his entire life he was receiving letters asking him to come back and resume his position and take, you know, all of that. He didn't want to. So we see this, he was, he had his eye on higher things, and he obviously had a very independent disposition. So what we know in this, I think in this first year, he went to Mintraling. We know one journey he undertook at that time, from starting in that area of Lhoka, he traveled to Hlojak, where there are many important ne associated with the Nyingma tradition, especially, and continued from Hlojak. You go to a place which is now in the far north of Bhutan, which is one of the 5 holy places of Guru Pema. And from there, he kept going down the valley and came as far as Bumtang in Bhutan, spent some time in Bumtang, and then came back the same way. This would all have been on foot, I think. Came back the same way and traveled back, and came back to Ngor. A journey of several months, which he undertook only with Sutrim, we think. Other occasions, we know that he traveled to some of the places mentioned in the guide formally, on horseback, with retinue, with large numbers of pack animals and servants and so on, in the company of other lamas. The prince, or one of the sons of the royal family anyway, of Dege, was studying in Ngor in the 1850s, and he traveled together in formal style with him to some places, and actually traveled back to Dege with him in that way, sort of fully catered for. And in between, we don't know. We don't have details about much else.
Cool, thank you. And recently in Toronto, Dongsa Khyentse Rinpoche said that Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo had 5 important female masters, and I wonder if you know know their names.
Right. Well, I didn't come prepared for this, but the most important that I know of is the Sanding Dorje Palmo,
Right.
who was one of his main teachers while in this period, when he was young. She actually died, I think, in the 1850s. So he studied with her in the 1840s, and there are praises to her in the collection, which make clear his extraordinary devotion to her. He also had some eminent female disciples in the Sakya tradition, including the Semo, the daughters of the Sakya throne holder of that time, Tamdren Wangmo in particular, but she was a student, not a teacher. His other female teachers would have been Eastern Tibetans, I think, because Sanding Dorje Palmo was the only one that's mentioned in this period in his travels.
So they aren't
Central Tibet.
They aren't
So
in his biography.
No,
Yeah.
not at
Okay.
all. No.
Mm.
So I'd like to see that list too. Yeah.
When I track them down, I'll let you know.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I think Pema Maya also has a question.
Yes, just briefly, speaking of lists, Matthew, if you mentioned in the beginning like the different biographers of Khyentse Wangpo, and we have like a tutorial coming up in a few days. So if there are any reading lists or lists of either Tibetan or translated works that you could recommend, some of the ones that you mentioned perhaps in the beginning of your talk, might be quite nice for us to do some follow-up reading.
Okay.
Would that be something not too much trouble? I tried to jot down some, but I didn't catch everything.
Oh. No, I mean all of those titles are easy to give.
Okay.
There's only one really biography. I mean, I mentioned the biography by Dodrup Chen,
Yeah.
but that's really largely derived from Kongtru's biography. I've done a translation, and I think it's going through KVP editing, but it adds a couple of anecdotes maybe, but it really doesn't add that much to our knowledge. So the main biography, which of course has been published in translation and is available online, is by far the main source, really, for this kind of information. The main these are giant classical historical works, Gurutashi, Sito Penchen, the Dome Chenjong. These are all very well known. I wouldn't put it on a reading list. I mean, these are things that would take years to read and study. They're huge, but you can get an idea by looking at them.
Matthew, I had one other question for you. You mentioned how evident it was that Khyentse Wangpo was the incarnation of so many masters. I wonder if you have some examples of things that he put into his writings that could only have been known through being the incarnation of a previous master. Is there some examples that you can think of like that, where it's really clear?
There are several, in the historical works, not so much. As I say, again, you have to read the biography where Kongtrul gives several examples of him, reminiscing about his previous lives. In terms of actual examples of the kind you're talking about, I think I've only really sort of noticed one, which is in these notes about the Terma tradition, where he talks about ambivalent Bonpo Buddhist Terma master of the 11th century called Phunse Kyungto. In the Guru Tashi Chenjung, which is sort of the most authoritative Terma history, written before his time, it's very close to him. The Guru Tashi Chenjung was written, in the previous generation, and it was written by a master from Xingkou, which is very close to where Khyentse was born. It's very, very close to him. He would have known this work really intimately, and obviously he uses it as the main source for his section on the Nyingma tradition in the Denrab, and for a lot of his references to the Terma tradition. In Guru Tashi's work, it says Phunse Kyungto is unknown. We don't know who he was. We don't have any details about him. In Khyentse's notes, he says Phunse Kyungto was a Bonpo mantrika from this area of Tibet who lived at this time and made these revelations. There is no known literary source for that information. So we could assume that it's coming from somewhere else, like Khyentse's own privileged knowledge of the past. But that's the only sort of direct example that I can think of.
Okay. Is there any other questions from anybody else in the audience?
There is one more in the chat.
Okay, somebody's asking, Surbi Bansal, are you here? Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I mean, I have written it, but again, I just wanted to know, like you briefly mentioned about Kailash, Chakrasamvara mountain and all. So I wanted to know, like, what I heard from few friends that next year is a good time for pilgrim as it's horse year, and you little bit mentioned about Rinpoche's pilgrim. Is there any pilgrim detail on that specific location or nearby? What's the importance in Tibetan Buddhism also?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Maybe just in case you didn't catch that, I'll just read the written question as well for your benefit.
Okay.
I'd love to know more about Mount Kailash in the context of Rinpoche's pilgrimage, particularly if there are any specific accounts or references to his journey there. Also, is the coming year considered auspicious or suitable for undertaking a pilgrimage to Kailash from a spiritual perspective? If so, could you kindly recommend any text, biographies, or accounts that detail Khyentse Wangpo's pilgrimage to Kailash?
Right. Okay, thanks. Okay, well, actually, the only reason that I mentioned Kailash is in the context of his work on his notes on the geographical tradition, the Indian geographical tradition, where he just picks up on the work of Sakya Pandita, which is a classic in the Tibetan tradition, the Domsun Rabye of Sakya Pandita from the 13th century, in which Sakya Pandita completely dismisses the idea that places like Mount Kailash and Mount Sari in southeastern Tibet are to be identified with the original pittas described in the Indian tradition, right? Because this is what's claimed by the Kagyu tradition in particular, the Drigungpa and the Drukpa and so on, founded monasteries around Kailash, taking it as a holy place in that sense. So this is quite a sort of intellectual controversy in the medieval Tibetan tradition. And Khyentse Rinpoche obviously sympathizes with Sakya Pandita's position that these ordinary mountains that we see in the world are not the ones which are described, in the Kala Chakra Tantra and so on. Sorry to disappoint you. But in terms of your question, no, Jamyang Khyentse never visited Kailash. He didn't go to central Tibet, and he doesn't mention it anywhere in his writings. It's not one of his concerns. Yes, major pilgrimage destinations in the Tibetan tradition, there is, in popular sort of lore, there is a certain year in the 12-year cycle is considered to be the best. And you're right, in terms of Mount Kailash, it's the horse year. But there's nothing in Khyentse Wangpo's sort of world and writings and thinking that has anything to do with Mount Kailash. So I'll leave it there. But there are obviously other sources about the Kailash pilgrimage in Tibetan, but they're not concerned by what we're talking about here today.
So is there any particular book on the pilgrims that Rinpoche himself took, like, power pieces of Tibet or something like that? If someone wants to trace or follow the footsteps of Rinpoche and take a pilgrim to the eastern Tibet, so is there any particular text that we can refer to?
Well, we've been discussing his guide to central Tibet, which I have published in translation quite some time ago, and which you can find. He also wrote Neik, individual works about places in Dege in eastern Tibet, of quite a different kind, because that's one of the things that he and Kongtrul and Chogyur Lingpa were involved in, was recognizing new places often associated with Guru Padma in Dege, which had not previously been recognized as holy places, and they did write guidebooks to these places. These are highly esoteric, poeticized in the traditional genre, so you can find those works more by Kongtrul and Chokling actually than by Khyentse, but those are there. But I haven't been talking about those today.
I think we've come to the end of our time now, Matthew. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to share all of the work that you've been doing on Khyentse Wangpo and for the project, and especially the insights that you've had in working on his historical works. It's really fascinating. Thank you so much for giving us the benefit of your knowledge, and please do more talks for us on any other historical texts that you are working on of Khyentse Wangpo's.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody, for coming. There will be a follow-up tutorial on the 25th if you're interested in exploring some more associated ideas around Khyentse Wangpo's life and pilgrimage, and particularly we're going to be talking a little bit about Songsar Monastery itself in the tutorial. So please come along to that, and keep checking our social media for our future Text of the Month texts and events. And thanks so much for contributing and coming, and see you next time. Thanks again, Matthew.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Matt.